The Drow Dungeons Dragons iconic dark elves have captured the imaginations of players for decades. These mysterious subterranean elves have been everything from terrifying villains to beloved heroes. In this video, we'll journey through the complete history and evolution of the Drow and D&D lore. We'll explore where the concept of Drow came from, how Gary Gygax introduced them in the early game, and how they changed with each edition. Along the way, we'll dive into their mythological inspirations, examine major Drow characters like Drizzt Do'Urden and the spider goddess Lolth, visit the infamous underground cities they call home, and see how game mechanics and storytelling have evolved around them. By the end, you'll understand why the Drow are such a significant part of D&D and what their future might hold. So grab your swords and spelunking gear and prepare to descend into the depths of D&D history. Every legend has an origin, and the idea of dark elves predates D&D by centuries. In Norse mythology, the Prose Edda speaks of dark elves who live beneath the ground and are blacker than pitch, an eerie precursor to the Drow's subterranean shadowy nature. European folklore from the Orkney and Shetland Islands even had a word, trow, or drow, meaning a malign fairy or troll. These myths painted elves as not always benevolent. Some were sinister creatures of the dark. Gary Gygax, co-creator of D&D, drew on these very inspirations when crafting the Drow. He once noted that tales of dark elves of evil nature provided an ideal basis for the creation of a unique new mythos for D&D. In other words, the concept of evil elves lurking below fit perfectly into the game's tapestry of monsters and villains. Early fantasy literature also paved the way. Authors like J.R.R. Tolkien had dark elves in Middle-earth, though Tolkien's were more tragic than evil. And Poul Anderson's The Broken Sword, 1954, featured brutal elf warriors, hinting that elves in fiction could have a dangerous side. D&D's Drow took these ideas a step further, making dark elves truly sinister and giving them a distinctive culture all their own. Gygax's genius was synthesizing myth and fantasy into the Drow, a race of elves corrupted by darkness living in an exotic underground realm. He added unique touches as well, such as their matriarchal society and spider-themed religion, which were not present in the original myths. This mix of real-world myth and original creation gave the Drow a feeling of deep authenticity within the game's lore, as if somewhere the collective subconscious, we already feared the idea of elves that lurk in darkness. Little did we know how important these Drow would become in D&D's own mythology. The Drow made their grand debut in AD&D First Edition as shadowy puppet masters behind the scenes. Gygax first teased their existence in the 1977 Monster Manual, which mentions the Black Elves or Drow only as legendary evil elves said to dwell deep underground. No stats, no images, just a hint of a sinister force in the depths. Players got their first real look at Drow in 1978 during the famous adventure series GDQ, Giant's Drow Queen. In Module G3, Hall of the Fire Giant King, the heroes discover that the recent alliance of rampaging giants was orchestrated by a mysterious Drow priestess named Eklavdra. This revelation led into modules D1 to 2, Descent into the Depths of the Earth, and D3, Vault of the Drow, which took players deep into the Underdark, a vast subterranean world, to pursue the Drow threat. There, players encountered the city of Arelhe Kinlu, a decadent metropolis of the Drow, and learned just how frightening their society was. The Drow were depicted as an underground matriarchal society of schemers and slavers, ruled with an iron fist by priestesses of their cruel spider goddess, Lolth. Betrayal and assassination were a way of life for them, and Lolth's will was law. In these early adventures, Drow women were typically the clerical leaders while males were warriors and wizards, a stark inversion of many surface societies. This matriarchy and devotion to a spider deity immediately set the Drow apart from any elf we'd seen before. Mechanically, first edition Drow were formidable. When their full stats were finally published in the Fiend Folio, 1981, players discovered these elves weren't pushovers. Drow had innate magical abilities, like summoning darkness and fairy fire, carried deadly hand crossbows with poisonous darts, and possessed magic resistance that made them hard to harm with spells. They wielded special adamantine weapons and armor crafted in the Underdark, gear of incredible quality that, in a neat twist, would disintegrate if exposed to sunlight too long. Compared to their surface cousins, Drow were faster, more agile, and almost always chaotic evil in alignment. In fact, early Drow were usually encountered as high-level opponents, often with class levels, like fighter clerics or fighter mages, making them very dangerous adversaries. Adventurers who braved the Vault of the Drow in 1978 had their hands full dealing with entire noble houses of these dark elves, each house complete with its own sigil, soldiers, and scheming matron mother. And at the pinnacle of Drow villainy stood Lolth herself, revealed in Q1, Queen of the Demon Web Pits, 1980, as the ultimate mastermind of the Giant Alliance. In that module, the heroes literally traveled to Lolth's lair on the 66th layer of the Abyss, the Demon Web Pits, to confront the Demon Queen of Spiders in an epic finale. It was a confrontation to remember. Lolth could appear as a giant black widow spider with the head of a female Drow, and she tested even the mightiest parties. By the end of first edition, the Drow had cemented themselves as one of D&D's premier villains, cunning, fearsome, and utterly compelling. Players were intrigued and a little terrified by these black-skinned, white-haired elves from the depths. If first edition introduced the Drow, second edition AD&D, late 1980s into the 1990s, is when the Drow truly became superstars of D&D lore. The game's focus shifted toward richer storytelling and expansive worlds, and the Drow were ready for the spotlight. In 1990, author R.A. Salvatore published The Crystal Shard, a Forgotten Realms novel that introduced a certain Drow ranger named Drizzt Do'Urden to the world. Drizzt's heroism and complexity, a good-hearted Drow fighting against the evil of his people, struck a chord with readers. Over the next few years, Salvatore's Dark Elf trilogy, 1990 to 1991, chronicled Drizzt's origins in the underdark city of Menzoberranzan, and suddenly, Drow were everywhere. Fans couldn't get enough of these dark elves. By 1991, it was essentially Drowmania. Anything involving Drow was guaranteed to draw interest. TSR, the publisher of D&D at the time, responded by greatly expanding Drow lore in the game itself. In 1991, Ed Greenwood, creator of the Forgotten Realms, wrote The Drow of the Underdark, a dedicated sourcebook that delved deeply into Drow society, religion, history, and culture. This book, jam-packed with details, from the Drow language to new spells and equipment, established many elements still known today. It described how Drow cities function, the structure of their noble houses, the role of Lolth's priesthood, and even everyday life for a dark elf. Greenwood's take on the Drow was that they were incredibly evil, treacherous, cruel, and self-serving, yet undeniably fascinating. Amusingly, Greenwood frames the book's information as knowledge gained from an interview with a Drow mage, giving it a fun in-universe narrative style. Around this time, the Forgotten Realms setting firmly took the mantle as the home of the Drow. While Greyhawk may have invented them, the Forgotten Realms ran with the idea and built an entire subculture around it. The city of Menzoberranzan, Drizzt's home city, was fully realized in a second edition boxed set in 1992, letting players run campaigns entirely among the Drow. Menzoberranzan is the archetypal Drow city, a vast cavern filled with obsidian spires and spider motifs, divided by warring houses and ruled by Lolth's priestesses. It set the standard for how a Drow city should feel, simultaneously magnificent and deadly. Mechanically, second edition refined Drow as well. They appeared as monsters in the Monstrous Compendium, 1989, and later the Monstrous Manual, 1993, which reinforced their abilities from first edition and added more lore. Uniquely, second edition also gave players the chance to play Drow characters, albeit with caution. The Complete Book of Elves, 1992, presented Drow as a playable subrace, but warned DMs to consider the challenges of an evil party member and Drow's potent abilities. Most tables at the time still treated Drow PCs as rare exceptions, often exiles or outcasts from Drow society. And indeed, Salvatore's Drizzt provided the perfect template for that. A Drow who left the evil of his people behind. In 1991's Drow of the Underdark, Greenwood introduced the goddess Ilistrae, a benevolent Drow deity of the moon and redemption, into official lore, giving a canonical path for Drow seeking good. This era also expanded the Drow pantheon beyond Lolth, adding gods like Veyron, a male Drow god of thieves and rebellion, and Kiaran-Sali, a Drow lich goddess of vengeance. These new lore elements made Drow society more complex than just Lolth says so. Now there were dissidents, different faiths, and even the idea, whispered though it was, that some Drow might not be irredeemably evil. But make no mistake, second edition primarily loved the Drow as villains. In many adventure modules and novels of the 90s, Drow were the ultimate schemers behind plots. They showed up in settings beyond the realms too. For example, the world of Greyhawk still had them. And even Dragonlance flirted with a dark elf concept, though in Dragonlance it meant a banished elf rather than the Drow race. By the late 90s, the image of the Drow had permeated all of D&D fandom. You had Drizzt on book covers wielding his scimitars. You had video games like Eye of the Beholder and Baldur's Gate featuring Drow characters. And you had dungeon masters everywhere eager to use the Drow in their campaigns. The Drow had evolved from a one-off adversary into a full-fledged cultural phenomenon within D&D. They were popular because they were so compellingly alien and evil. Yet players were also starting to explore the idea of the misunderstood Drow, the one who rebels against the darkness. This duality planted seeds that would fully bloom in coming editions. The year 2000 brought D&D 3rd edition, and with it came further evolution for our favorite Dark Elves. 3rd edition's philosophy was everything can be playable or customizable, and that applied to Drow too. In 3.0/3.5, the Drow appeared prominently in the core monster manual as a standard creature, meaning DMs were definitely expected to use them, and rules were provided for Drow as a playable race. However, the designers were careful to balance their formidable powers. Drow in 3rd Ed had a level adjustment of +2, meaning if you played a Drow, you were essentially 2 levels behind a normal character, to offset their innate magic and high abilities. This was an attempt to recognize that Drow had superior traits, like magic resistance, bonus spells, and enhanced vision, compared to baseline races. So mechanically, Drow became a bit more accessible to players, but with built-in costs to keep things fair. Many players, of course, happily took on those penalties for the chance to play a sleek, dual scimitar-wielding Drow like Drizzt. Lore-wise, 3rd edition continued to deepen the Drow story across various D&D worlds. The Forgotten Realms in particular had some major Drow-centric events during the 3rd edition era. One of the biggest was the War of the Spider Queen, a novel series, 2002 to 2005, and concurrent game storyline where Lolth mysteriously went silent, throwing her followers into chaos. This story, set in the Forgotten Realms world, showcased the different factions of Drow that had developed. Some remained loyal to Lolth despite her silence. Others sought out alternative gods or paths. It highlighted something important. Not all Drow were monolithic. By this time, we knew of Drow who rejected Lolth's cruelty, like followers of Eilistrae, the good Drow goddess, who had steadily gained lore since her 1991 introduction. There were also male Drow aligned with Eberron, plotting against the matriarchy, and rogue houses trying to carve their own power. The lore in sourcebooks reflected this rich tapestry. For example, Races of Faerun, 2003, and Underdark, 2003, for 3rd edition detailed Drow society and factions extensively. We learned about Drow enclaves that might trade uneasily with other races, Drow enclaves that had been destroyed or gone into exile, and even surface Drow settlements formed by rebels who left the Underdark. Drow were still usually villains in published adventures, but their motivations and society were now more fleshed out than ever. Importantly, 3rd edition also introduced the Drow into new settings with new twists. The biggest example is Eberron, released in 2004. In Eberron's pulp adventure world, Drow exist, but they're quite different from the classic Lolth worshippers. In fact, Lolth doesn't even exist in Eberron's pantheon. Instead, the Drow of Eberron dwell in the shattered continent of Zendrik, remnants of an ancient war. These Drow have their own religions and cultures. Many worship a scorpion god named Volkor, seeing scorpions as holy and viewing spiders as merely lesser creatures. Others, called the Sulatar, follow the magical traditions of Giant Empire, essentially fire magic, and a group known as the Umbragian embrace shadow magic. The Eberron Drow are tribal, living in jungle ruins and caverns, and often war with the remnants of giants or among themselves. This reimagining kept the cool factor of dark-skinned, nocturnal elves, but divorced it from the familiar Lolth storyline, giving Drow a fresh identity in a new world. It showed that the concept of Drow was versatile. It didn't have to be tied to one set of gods or one style of society. Meanwhile, back in the Greyhawk setting, which remained the default for core D&D lore in 3rd edition, Drow were present, but not spotlighted as much. Greyhawk's Drow remained much like Gygax's original, lurking in Earth's Underdark, serving Lolth. Greyhawk did not adopt the Forgotten Realms editions like Eilistrae, In fact, as later noted, Greyhawk's Drow really only recognize Lolth and perhaps an elder elemental god, making them a bit different pantheon-wise. From a mechanics and gameplay perspective, 3.5 edition, the 2003 revision of 3rd edition, showered Drow enthusiasts with options. There was a complete or Master Series book for just about everything, and the Drow got their own in 3.5 with Drow of the Underdark, 2007. Not to be confused with the 1991 AD&D book of the same name. This was a 3.5 supplement that included new prestige classes, like Drow Judicator or Demon Binder, feats, equipment, like the famous Drow Long Knife, and variant Drow, Ichi, Deepworm Drow who had mingled bloodlines with dragons, etc. It even provided a Drow Paragon class in Unearthed Arcana, 2004, letting a Drow character take levels to emphasize their racial abilities. In other words, if you wanted to play a campaign as all Drow or heavily featuring Drow, 3rd edition had you covered with an abundance of material. DMs could design entire Drow cities and political intrigue campaigns, while players could fine-tune their Dark Elf characters with lots of crunch. By the end of 3.5, the Drow had fully transcended being just those evil elves in one module. They were a core part of D&D's identity. You'd find them in video games, comic books, miniatures lines, and they were a favorite topic in Dragon magazine articles. The image of the Drow, the lithe, ebon-skinned elf with white hair, clad in spider silk and wielding a blade, was instantly recognizable even to people who hadn't played D&D in years. And importantly, the idea that a Drow didn't have to be a villain was now firmly planted in the culture. Drizzt's continued popularity and characters like him meant that by the 2000s a party of player characters might very well include a Drow hero. This was a huge shift from the early days when Drow were only antagonists. D&D's rules and lore had evolved to support both sides of the coin. You could run Drow as the classic evil schemers, and you could tell stories of defiant, honorable Drow seeking redemption. The stage was set for even bigger changes to come. In 2008, Wizards of the Coast launched D&D 4th edition, and this edition brought some significant and controversial changes to many aspects of lore, the Drow included. One hallmark of 4th edition was that it tried to reimagine the core mythology of D&D in a fresh way. The designers crafted a new default setting, the Nentir Vale cosmology, and tinkered with the origin stories of various races and gods. In this new vision, all elves had a shared origin and then split. The backstory, as presented in sources like Dragon magazine and Manual of the Plains, described a primal Fey race that was sundered in an ancient conflict. Corellin Lorethian, the chief elf god, versus Lolth, then called Arashni, Corellin's consort who betrayed him. The myths said that when Lolth rebelled, those elves who followed her were cursed and banished, becoming the Drow. Meanwhile, other elves split into the familiar elves and Eladrin, 4th edition's term for high elves. This isn't entirely new. Previous editions hinted at a descent of the Drow in myth, but 4th edition spotlighted it and tweaked details. Notably, Sehanine, Moon Goddess, and Lolth were recast as sisters in the core pantheon, with Lolth embodying the more extreme, ruthless side of elfdom. Essentially, 4th edition made the Drow origin a central myth. Once all elves were one people, then an ideological schism, freedom and art versus ambition and cruelty, caused the elven civil war of the gods, resulting in Lolth and her followers being cast down. This lore painted Lolth almost sympathetically in some texts, as a powerful entity who wanted to free elves from Corellon's influence, albeit in a self-serving way. It was a radical shift that reframed the Drow not just as evil for evil's sake, but as the product of a cosmic tragedy and betrayal. On the mechanical side, 4th edition made an unprecedented move. It put Drow front and center as a playable race from near the start. The Forgotten Realms Player's Guide, published 2008, alongside the 4th edition core books, included Drow as a playable option. And in Player's Handbook 2, 2009, and later the Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms 2010 book, Drow were presented as one of the main player races of D&D 4th edition. This was huge. Previous editions, while they allowed Drow PCs, usually relegated them to optional status or DM supervision, but 4th edition embraced them fully. Want to play a Drow? Go for it. The implication was that not all Drow in the world are bound to be evil. In fact, the 4th edition source, Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms, explicitly stated there was no default alignment for Drow characters, and highlighted the idea of Drow who break away from the evil Lolth-based societies. This shows how far things had come, from always chaotic evil to often evil, but player characters might be rebels. 4th edition. Drow had distinct racial traits reflecting their lore. They retained dark vision, had a trait called Cloud of Darkness, allowing them to create a zone of darkness once per encounter, and a dark fire ability, shedding violet fairy fire on an enemy. These abilities were riffs on classic Drow magic in a new 4th edition mechanic style. Gone was the old percent magic resistance. Instead, Drow got a bonus to will defense versus charm effects to represent mental fortitude. In combat, a Drow PC felt agile and tricky, fitting their roguish, backstabbing image. And yes, Drizzt fans, the two-scimitar style was alive and well through powers and feats. The key takeaway is that 4th edition normalized Drow as just another character choice, much like dwarves or tieflings. This was part of 4th edition's broader effort to modernize and balance the game, but it also reflected changing attitudes. It was no longer seen as necessary to forbid or heavily restrict monstrous races like the Drow. In terms of story and setting, 4th edition made some big changes, especially in the Forgotten Realms. The realm's timeline jumped forward a century for 4th edition, and in that intervening time, some major events happened in Drow lore, thanks to novels like the Lady Penitent series. In Forgotten Realms, Lolth ended up even more firmly in charge of the Drow. Some of the kinder Drow deities like Ilastrae were, at least temporarily, gone from the picture, and Lolth had begun a campaign to expand her influence. She even attempted to elevate herself from a demon goddess of chaos to a broader deity of dark fate in the 4th edition lore, seeking to become the goddess of spider, shadow, and assassins everywhere. Meanwhile, some Drow in the realms were said to have found other faiths or escaped to the surface during the spell-plagued chaos. So you had essentially a split among Drow. Those who remained in the classic Lolthite cities, like Menzoberranzan, which still thrived, and isolated groups who rejected her. The 4th edition Forgotten Realms campaign guide mentions a group of Drow in the Corman Thor forest who had abandoned Lolth and were attempting to build a new life above ground, an idea carried from earlier lore but more acknowledged now. In other settings, 4th edition continued the idea. Eberron's Drow remained as they were, with Volker, etc. And in other worlds, Drow could pop up with various allegiances. Planescape fans noticed one interesting cosmology tweak. In 4th edition, Lolth's demon web pits were no longer just another layer of the abyss, but became their own astral dominion, essentially her own mini-plane. This elevated Lolth's status in the cosmos. She effectively graduated from demon lord to full god in cosmic ranking, reflecting her importance to Drow across the multiverse. Reception to 4th edition's changes was mixed. Some fans loved the accessible, heroic Drow. Others missed the more dangerous, forbidden edge of playing a Drow. But love it or not, 4th edition had undeniably shifted the identity of Drow in D&D. They were no longer strictly almost always evil. They had a tragic origin story that gave context to their evil, and the game encouraged you to think about Drow who might not fit the mold. And with Drow appearing as protagonists in official adventures, for example, the 4th edition adventure Demon Queen's Enclave, 2008, even allowed players to potentially ally with a renegade Drow faction against a greater threat. The line between friend and foe was blurrier. That said, the classic portrayal of Drow was far from gone. Most Drow NPCs and societies in 4th edition materials were still depicted as the cruel, Lolth worshippers we love to hate. The difference is that now the books explicitly acknowledge those few who rebel, and mechanically back that up by inviting players to tell those stories. In short, 4th edition kept all the style and flair of the Drow, but updated the substance to fit a more modern fantasy ethos. It was a radical shift at the time, but one that paved the way for how Drow would be handled going forward into the next edition. In 2014, D&D 5th edition arrived, and it represented something of a back-to-basics approach for many aspects of the game. For the Drow, 5th edition took cues from the past and the lessons learned in the 2000s, resulting in a portrayal that honors the classic lore while integrating modern sensibilities. Right out of the gate, the Drow are present in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, 2014, as one of the 3 sub-races of elves, alongside High Elves and Wood Elves. The description notes that Drow are more often evil than not, and feared on the surface world, a nod to their traditional role as villains, but it also makes clear that exceptions exist, especially for player characters. So unlike 4th edition, which omitted any alignment tendency, 5th edition reintroduced the idea that most Drow in the lore are evil, but without making it absolute. This was part of 5th edition's general philosophy of embracing archetypes but leaving room for player creativity. Mechanically, a 5th edition Drow player character looks a lot like the classic version. They have dark vision twice as far as other elves because they basically live in darkness, innate Drow magic, dancing lights cantrip, and at higher levels fairy fire and darkness spells, very much the legacy of their 1st edition/2nd edition abilities, and sunlight sensitivity, a drawback causing disadvantage on attacks and perception in direct sunlight. They also traditionally got a boost to charisma on top of the base elf dexterity boost in the early 5th edition rules, reflecting their forceful personalities. These traits clearly hark back to old-school Drow qualities and make Drow PCs feel distinct. If you play a Drow in 5th edition, you'll notice that you're superb underground or at night, but at high noon you might struggle, a built-in roleplay and mechanical hook. Over time, Wizards of the Coast adjusted some of these rules. By 2022's Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse, racial ability score bonuses became more flexible, so Drow aren't locked to a Dex Cha combo, and some wording around alignments was further softened, but the core flavor remained. Drow are the only subrace in the PHB with a significant weakness, sunlight sensitivity, to balance strong abilities, underlining that historically they weren't meant to roam the sunny lands, at least not without some challenges. On the lore front, 5th edition largely returned to the classic Forgotten Realms depiction of the Drow. The major 5th edition adventures and source books heavily feature the Forgotten Realms, where Drow equals Lolth-worshipping underground elves, unless noted otherwise. For example, the 5th edition adventure Out of the Abyss 2015 starts off with the player characters captured by Drow and imprisoned in a bleak Underdark outpost. That adventure showcases Drow slavers, a Drow priestess villain, and even brings Lolth's influence into the storyline as demon lords run amok in the Underdark. The Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide 2015 gives a write-up of the Drow of Faerun, re-establishing the existence of major Drow cities like Menzoberranzan and Chednasad, and the worship of Lolth as the thing that defines Drow culture. In these descriptions, we're back to the familiar hierarchy of Lolth equals ultimate authority, with houses vying for her favor. The 5th edition portrayal doesn't shy away from emphasizing how brutal Drow society is under Lolth's shadow, just like old times. However, 5th edition also integrates the modern twist, acknowledging diversity and breaking the mold when desired. A key source book here is Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, 2018. This book has a whole chapter on the eternal conflict between elves and Drow, and it retells the origin story of Lolth's betrayal of Corellon in a manner that meshes the realm's myth with core lore. It describes how Arachne, Lolth, turned the ancient elves against Corellon, leading to the elves' descent, literally, the event of the Drow being cursed and banished underground. The lore presented is very much in line with earlier editions, but with one crucial update. It clearly states that not all Drow fell under Lolth's sway forever. It mentions Illustrae and other Dark Seldarine deities as alternative paths, and even talks about Drow societies unconnected to Lolth that have since arisen. This was a tip of the hat to the idea that, after so many years, D&D canon now includes Drow, who are morally and culturally distinct from the archetype. For instance, 5th edition's Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, 2020, which details the world of Critical Role's Exandria setting, introduces the Kryn dynasty, a society of dark elves who worship a Luxon, a mysterious light deity, rather than Lolth, and who have established a mostly honorable nation above ground. The book notes these Wildemount Drow were liberated from Lolth generations ago, and are not viewed as inherently evil by their neighbors. Wizards of the Coast even stated in a 2020 press release that in certain settings, like Eberron and Wildemount, Drow are presented as more morally and culturally complex and not universally villainous. This reflects an ongoing effort to ensure D&D's portrayal of traditionally evil races isn't one-note or racially determinist. Another big development in 5th edition, just outside of gamebooks, bridging into the fiction and future canon, came with R.A. Salvatore's return to Drizzt's story in the 2010s, in a series of novels leading up to and including Starlight Enclave, 2021. Salvatore introduced new groups of Drow in the Forgotten Realms, specifically the Evendro, a peaceful isolationist group of Drow living in the far north, in Icewind Dale's polar regions, and the Lorendro, a group living in the jungles in the far south. These groups have no connection to Lolth. They evolved separately. This was a significant retcon expansion. It means that Lolth's cult in Menzoberranzan is not the be-all end-all of dark elf existence. Wizards promoted this as part of the Summer of Drizzt in 2021, effectively making it official that Drow are not all one culture. An article on the D&D website highlighted that revelation, noting that for 40-plus years we assumed all Drow were Lolth worshippers. But now it's canon that entire civilizations of Drow exist, who never fell under Lolth's sway. This is a huge modern twist. It allows for Drow who might be neutral or even good as a culture, not just as rare individuals. And it addresses long-standing commentary from fans and critics that having an intrinsically evil, dark-skinned race could carry unfortunate real-world connotations. By diversifying the Drow, D&D is showing that nurture, society, religion is what made the classic Drow evil, not nature. If you change those factors, you change the Drow. Practically, at the table, 5th edition DMs are encouraged to use the Drow in a way that fits their story. If you want the classic Drizzt is the only good one and all the rest are evil vibe, the core books have you covered. If you want a more nuanced, underdark political drama where there are factions of Drow with different alignments and goals, the lore now supports that too. And if you simply love Drow as a player option, but don't want the baggage of being from an evil society, you can easily say your character hails from one of these alternate Drow cultures, or create your own twist. Mechanically, 5th edition also eased up as the edition matured. By 2022, they officially stated that things like sunlight sensitivity could be ignored or house-ruled if it caused unfun limitations, especially in campaigns that take place mostly outdoors. The community has broadly accepted that Drow PCs are fine and not game-breaking, so they've become pretty common in online games, streams, and home campaigns. In essence, 5th edition brought the Drow back to their roots, the terrifying dark elves of the Underdark, ruled by the Spider Queen, but with a modern understanding that Drow, like all peoples, can be more than one thing. It's a balance between tradition and progress. The classic Drow are still there in all their wicked glory for those riveting hero versus villain stories. And the modern Drow, the Drizzt, the outcasts, or those from different cultures, are validated too, giving players and DMs more freedom than ever to tell unique stories with this race. The result is that the Drow remain one of the most interesting and talked about parts of D&D lore, even after all these years. One of the fascinating things about Dungeons & Dragons is that it encompasses many worlds, campaign settings, each with its own flavor. The Drow, being so popular, have appeared or been adapted in numerous settings, sometimes with intriguing differences. Let's take a quick tour of how Drow have been portrayed across a few major D&D worlds. If there's one setting most responsible for the Drow's massive popularity, it's the Forgotten Realms. The Realms not only adopted the Drow from Greyhawk, but also expanded and popularized them through novels and dedicated game products. In the Forgotten Realms, the Drow are practically synonymous with the city of Menzoberranzan, the City of Spiders. Hidden deep beneath the north of Faerun, Menzoberranzan is a sprawling cavern city ruled by the Church of Lolth. It's the definitive Drow metropolis, an archetypal Drow city, divided among noble houses and ruled by priestesses of Lolth. betrayal, assassination, and slavery are everyday facts of life there, and status is everything. The most powerful figure is typically the matron mother of the first house, such as the ruthless matron Ben-Ray in Drizdt's stories. The Forgotten Realms Drow society is heavily detailed. We know about their classes, like the warrior class Melee Magther and Wizard Academy Sorcerer at the training school of Tyrbresh. Their weapons, the iconic hand crossbow with toxin-coated bolts, comes from Forgotten Realms lore, and their rivalries, house feuds, scheming mercenary bands like Brigand Diartha, etc. What sets the Realms Drow apart is also the presence of numerous Drow deities beyond Lolth, collectively known as the Dark Seldarine. The Forgotten Realms introduced gods like Illustrae, Eberron, Kiaransali, Selvatarm, and others, each with their own cults and followers among the Drow. This means that within the Forgotten Realms Underdark, not all Drow worship Lolth, though she is dominant. For example, there have been lore about secret communities of Drow on the surface who worship Illustrae and try to live in peace, or mercenary bands in the Underdark that secretly honor Eberron's edicts to undermine the matriarchy. Forgotten Realms literature and game modules often explore these nuances. That said, Lolth's shadow looms largest. The vast majority of known Forgotten Realms Drow cities, Menzoberranzan, Ched Nasad, Ust Natha, etc., are Lolthite, and any dissent is brutally crushed if discovered. The Forgotten Realms Drow are also noteworthy for their interactions with other races. They frequently war with dwarves, the Silver Marches War, for instance, raid surface elves and humans for slaves or resources, and have long-standing enmities with races like the Svirfneblin, deep gnomes, and Illithids, mind flayers, in the Underdark. On occasion, they'll even ally with certain Underdark races if it serves Lolth's ends. For example, they might work with Duergar, dark dwarves, or fiendish creatures. Of course, we can't mention the realms without circling back to Drizzt Do'Urden, who is an export of this setting. His stories, starting in Icewind Dale, then moving to Menzoberranzan and beyond, have essentially become a part of the realm's canon history. The events of his life, like the chaos he caused in Menzoberranzan when he escaped, or the war he was involved in between Menzoberranzan and Mithril Hall, are referenced in source books. The presence of a famous renegade like Drizzt in the lore even gives DMs a hook. Your players' characters might have heard of this legendary Drow ranger who fights for good, which in-world might influence how people view your Drow PC. "Hey, you're not going to pull a Drizzt on us, are you?" might say a suspicious guardsman to a Drow adventurer. In recent Realms lore, especially with Salvatore's newer books, the Forgotten Realms is also the testbed for the new Drow ideas like the Evendro and Lorendro mentioned earlier. So the Realms now officially contains multiple Drow cultures, the classic Lolthite cities, still the majority and still very much evil, and a few distant enclaves of dark elves who are not part of that. This adds even more depth to the setting. But overall, if someone says Drow City, most D&D fans will immediately think Menzoberranzan. That's how influential the Forgotten Realms portrayal has been. It's the benchmark for Drow lore in many ways. The world of Greyhawk is where the Drow first saw the light of day, or should we say the darkness of the deep earth. Greyhawk's Drow were introduced by Gygax in those early modules we discussed, and their original home is the Vault of the Drow, an immense cavern city called Errol Kinlu on the world of Uerth. In Greyhawk lore, Errol-Hay Kinlu is a city of wicked decadence, where drow and allied creatures engage in trade, revelry, and political machinations, all under the watchful and vengeful eye of Lolth's priesthood. Politically, one could say the Greyhawk Drow society depicted in Vault of the Drow is the template that later Forgotten Realms Drow society was based on. Noble houses, ruling matrons, constant intrigue. One interesting aspect in Greyhawk is the presence of the Elder Elemental God, EEG, in the Vault of the Drow storyline. In that plot, one faction of Drow, House Isle serves, led by Aklavdra, had actually turned away from Lolth to secretly worship an alien Elder Elemental God, causing a bit of a religious schism. This is why Aklavdra was brokering alliances with giants. She was, in a sense, going rogue from Lolth's direct control. Greyhawk lore suggests that Lolth and the Elder Elemental God were rivals for Drow worship. This bit of lore is unique to Greyhawk. In the Forgotten Realms, Lolth has different rivals, like other Dark Seldarine gods, but the EEG plot was largely self-contained to that Greyhawk series. Regarding deities, as noted, Lolth is a Greyhawk deity in origin. Other Drow gods like Veyron or Illustrae were not part of Greyhawk's mythos. They were later inventions for the realms. So typically, Greyhawk Drow just worship Lolth, or possibly the EEG in that one offshoot case. This means Greyhawk's Drow come off even more uniformly, Lolth devoted and cruel. There aren't known goodly Drow enclaves on Orth in published Greyhawk materials, aside from rare individuals. In the Greyhawk timeline, after the events of Queen of the Demon Web Pits, Lolth's influence presumably persisted, and Gygax's later novels, the Gord the Rogue series, continued to show Drow as major villains. Aklavdra returns in those novels serving Lolth again, etc. In terms of how Greyhawk Drow fit into their world, they are one power among many in Orth's Underdark. Greyhawk's setting wasn't as Underdark heavy as the realms, but it had its fair share. The Drow in Greyhawk often clashed with the elves of Selene, a surface elf kingdom, and meddled in the affairs of the Flaneus, the main continent, through proxies, like inciting those giant raids as per the GDQ series. So in Greyhawk, Drow were that ultimate puppet master villain to throw into an epic campaign. Many Greyhawk DMS have used them in that way. The party might spend a long time fighting surface evils, only to discover at the end that Lolth's priests were pulling the strings. This formula, of course, was popularized by Gygax. When comparing Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms Drow, there is often a friendly rivalry among fans. Greyhawk loyalists sometimes quip that the Drow were ours first, and that the realms made them too sympathetic or too ubiquitous. There's a bit of truth there. Greyhawk Drow remained mostly a terrifying adversary to be overcome, old school style, whereas the realms, especially via Drizzt, made them more nuanced and, in some cases, heroic. One isn't better than the other. They're just different flavors. Greyhawk gives you the classic undiluted Drow and bad vibe if that's what you want for your game, with perhaps a pulp, sword, and sorcery edge. After all, Gygax's inspirations included things like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, which lend a certain dark decadence to his Drow. In modern D&D products, Greyhawk doesn't get as much attention, but the legacy of Greyhawk's Drow is alive whenever we mention those first modules, or the fact that Lolth's first name was Lolth, Demon Queen of Spiders, in the context of Greyhawk. For completeness, Greyhawk's other notable drow character beyond Aclavdra might be Durkan Gale in some later LGG material, or a few from the Living Greyhawk campaign, but none approach the fame of, say, Drizzt or Jarlaxle from Forgotten Realms. Greyhawk drow are the original article, pure, unredeemed enemies that lurk just off the map, plotting your demise. And when they strike, woe to the unwary adventurer. Switching gears, Eberron offers probably the most unique twist on drow in D&D. When Eberron was created in the early 2000s by Keith Baker & Co., one of its design principles was to subvert typical fantasy tropes. For example, elves in Eberron are often desert-dwelling mummy guardians or fierce dinosaur riders, not your standard Tolkien-esque elves. Similarly, the drow in Eberron break the mold. They're not a widespread underground civilization menacing the world. Instead, they are mostly confined to the mysterious continent of Zendrik, a land of jungles, ruins, and dangerous magic. Essentially, Eberron's lost world that was once ruled by giants. The lore says that during the ancient wars on Zendrik, the giants enslaved many elves. When the giant civilization collapsed, some elves escaped and eventually left for other continents, becoming the ancestors of modern elves. But those who remained in Zendrik, hardened by the cataclysm, evolved into the drow. So Eberron drow are actually the descendants of elves who didn't flee slavery, adapting to a harsh land filled with magical fallout. This immediately sets their origin apart. They weren't cursed by a spider goddess. They were shaped by survival and perhaps the influence of an ominous magical catastrophe, the Traveler's Curse, or the aftermath of the giant Kubara Dragon's war in Eberron lore. In terms of appearance, Eberron drow still have the dark skin white hair combo, but many carve white tattoos or scars into their skin as part of their culture, often using scorpion venom in the scarring process. They also often adorn themselves with tribal decorations, bones, feathers, and the like. They are typically divided into tribes rather than large cities. 3 main cultural groups are detailed. The Volker-worshipping drow, sometimes called Volkerites or Volkerim. Volker is a deity unique to Eberron's drow, envisioned as a gigantic scorpion god. The drow regard scorpions as sacred creatures, much like spiders are sacred to Lolth's drow. They believe Volkor sometimes takes the form of a giant scorpion or a scorpion-man hybrid. Interestingly, some Eberron scholars in-game speculate Volkor might be a facet of the Mockery, one of the Dark Six gods, or even an aspect of Lolth by another name, but to the drow of Zendrik, Volkor is their prime god. These drow live in the jungle ruins and caverns of Zendrik, often near the shattered remnants of giant cities. They are fierce hunter-gatherer types who launch guerrilla raids on the expeditions of treasure hunters from Corvair, the main continent, who come to Zendrik seeking giant artifacts. They use blowguns, poisons, and boomerangs. Zendrik boomerangs are a known drow weapon, and they craft armors from chitin and hides rather than metal. A fun tidbit: in Eberron, spiders are considered lesser beings, kinda how we think of bugs versus scorpions. So an Eberron drow might scoff at a spider motif. Those weaklings. A true predator has a stinger. The Sulatar drow. This is a smaller group who are sometimes called the Firebinders. They deny the ways of their Volkor-worshipping kin, and instead remained loyal to the teachings of their ancient giant masters. The The Sulatar believe that by keeping the magic of the giants, specifically elemental binding magic, they will earn a paradise of fire, which might be the plane of Fernia, plane of fire, where they'll gain immortality. They don't exactly worship a god. Rather, they revere this promise of fire. The Sulatar live in isolated volcanic or mountainous areas of Zendrik, often continuing to practice advanced magic like binding fire elementals into weapons and armor. They're basically a sect of technocratic, magic-wielding drow that other Zendrik drow view as heretics or oddballs. In a game, encountering Sulatar might mean dealing with drow who have fire-infused gear and perhaps even elemental allies, a very different flavor from the more primitive Volkor tribes. The Umbregan Drow. These are sometimes called the Shadow Drow. They were introduced in third-party content in Dragon Magazine during 3.5 edition for Eberron. The Umbregan lived underground, yes, actual Underdark style, beneath Zendrik and were driven almost to extinction by an invasion of aberrations. They turned to shadow magic and bonded with a force called the Umbra to survive. By 5th edition, they're not in main Eberron sourcebooks, but many Eberron DMs still include them as a secretive clan of drow-wielding shadow power, perhaps living under the ruins of the giant mega-city of Zendrik's heart. Additionally, Eberron hints there may be other drow cultures on Zendrik or elsewhere yet undiscovered. For instance, some drow tribes called the Kaltiar are mentioned briefly as worshipping nature spirits instead of Volkor, and there are a handful of urban drow exiles who live in the city of Stormreach, integrating a bit with other races, a concept that never really existed in Forgotten Realms or GH. Drow living openly among humans in a city without immediate chaos. What's really compelling about Eberron's take is how it's self-contained. The Drow aren't worldwide villains. They are more like an endangered indigenous people in a remote continent, dealing with treasure hunters and remnants of colonial-esque giant overlords. Adventurers coming from the main civilized lands of Eberron to Zendrik might initially think, "Oh, Drow, evil monsters," but discover these people have their own rich culture and are not simply evil for evil's sake. They're often defending their homeland from intruders, like potentially the player characters. It can lead to interesting moral dilemmas or role reversals. Plus, the Drow's imagery and themes in Eberron are refreshingly different. Scorpions and fire instead of spiders and shadow. Mechanically, in 5th edition Eberron's book, Eberron Rising from the Last War, Drow use the same stats as regular Drow, but a DM might waive sunlight sensitivity because Zendrik Drow actually operate on the surface a lot in daylight. The jungle canopy helps, though. The lore explicitly mentions the Drow of Zendrik in the 5th edition Eberron book, ensuring they remain a part of the setting. In summary, Eberron's Drow show how flexible the concept is. They prove you can remove Lolth entirely and still have a compelling dark elf society. In Eberron, the Drow went from being nearly a cliché, post-Drizzt, everyone knew what a Drow was, to feeling new and unpredictable again, which was a hit with many DMs and players. It also meant that for once, when exploring ruins and a bunch of dark-skinned elves ambushed the party, the story wasn't already written by trope. Players had to learn who these people were on Eberron's terms. Beyond the big three settings above, Drow have made appearances or notable absences in other D&D worlds. Ravenloft, the Domains of Dread. Ravenloft is a horror-themed setting essentially D&D's take on Gothic horror with the demiplane of imprisoned Dark Lords. One might think Drow would make great creepy villains in Ravenloft, and indeed early on the Ravenloft writers considered that. In the Realm of Terror boxed set, 1990, the first Ravenloft set, one domain called Arak was said to be inhabited by Drow. However, almost immediately the designers reversed course. They felt Drow didn't quite fit the Gothic mood. Perhaps they were too fantastical or would overshadow the more human-centric horror. So they scrapped that idea and instead created the Arak, also known as Shadow Fae, to take the Drow's place. The Arak are effectively a different species, Fae creatures, not humanoid elves, divided into Seelie and Unseelie courts, with various breeds like the sinister Sith or blood-drinking Powery, etc. The lore even explains in character that the early tales of Drow in that domain were mistaken identity. Humans who didn't know better called the Arak Drow at first. So in Ravenloft continuity, true Drow do not exist, at least not as a prominent culture. The focus shifted to these Shadow Fae as the Dark Elven analog, but with a very Fae folklore spin more fitting to Ravenloft's atmosphere. Later Ravenloft material, like the Shadow Rift sourcebook, delves deep into Arak society and their enigmatic ruler, and there's nary a mention of Lolth or Drow. That said, individual Drow could still end up in Ravenloft via the mists. The setting's gimmick is that people from any world can be drawn into Ravenloft if they're evil enough or fate decrees it. For example, a sadistic Drow warlord could become a minor lord of a pocket domain. In novels and fan lore, there were a few instances. One Ravenloft novel had a illusory Drow villain. It turned out to be a faker, if I recall correctly. And in 5th edition's Curse of Strahd adventure, there's actually a friendly Dusk Elf NPC. Dusk Elves in that context are a type of elf that did something terrible and were cursed. They're not exactly Drow, more like an elf subrace unique to Ravenloft. But by and large, Ravenloft proper decided that the Arak, Shadow Fae, filled that niche and allowed them to craft a different kind of creepy Gothic Fae horror vibe. So Ravenloft's unique way of featuring Drow was, interestingly, not featuring them, choosing a different path to maintain genre. Planescape isn't a world, but a multiverse setting connecting all others. In Planescape, 1994, you could meet anyone from anywhere in the D&D multiverse in the city of Sigil or out on the plains. So of course Drow showed up. A Drow on the planar scene might be an adventurer, an outlaw, or more likely, part of Lolth's divine realm. Planescape's lore took special care detailing the gods and their planar domains. Lolth's realm, the Demon Web Pits, is described as a horrific tangle of web-choked corridors on the abyss, layers 66 and 67. In Planescape terms, Lolth is an intermediate power of the chaos, evil pantheon of elves, the Dark Seldarine. Planescape materials noted that all Drow gods, the Dark Seldarine like Eberron, Kiaran Sali, etc., resided in the Demon Web Pits as Lolth's guest deities or lieutenants. Lolth, being the big boss, was often scheming against other demon lords, like Grazist, or fighting the eternal blood war peripherally. A particularly cool Planescape adventure is Dead Gods, where one of the Drow gods, Kiaran Sali, features in a plotline about resurrecting an evil deity. Planescape also formalized the idea that on the plains, belief shapes reality, so the Drow, being so fervent in their worship, gave Lolth a lot of power. In a way, Planescape portrayed Lolth as having influence far beyond just the Drow race. She's known and feared among demons and gods alike. She even has a proxy in Planescape lore. And guess who it is? Eclavdra, the classic Greyhawk Drow priestess, is said to be Lolth's proxy, personal emissary on the plains. This is a neat nod that connects back to Gygax's character and shows she transcended to an almost demigod-like role in Planescape lore. For player characters, Planescape allowed Drow just like any other race, though walking around Sigil, a cosmopolitan city, a Drow might actually be less remarked upon than on the surface world, because folks in Sigil have seen everything. Some Planescape fan favorite characters include a Drow named Vardis Timlin, trapped in a shadowy prison with a magic sword, and an elf fighter from Planescape's Blood Wars card game, who might have been a Drow. Little tidbits for flavor. Overall, Planescape's unique contribution was putting the Drow in a cosmic context. It answered questions like, what happens to Drow souls when they die? Answer, they go to Lolth's realm if they're loyal, or maybe get snatched by demons if not. What do other races think of Lolth on the plains? She's a known player in the Abyss, one of many vying for power. It even had the second edition expedition to the Demon Web Pits crossover module, revisiting Q1's premise for planar adventurers. So in Planescape, you might run into a Drow ambassador in the city of Dis, or a party of Drow mercenaries selling their swords in Sigil, etc. They weren't central in Planescape's story, but they were part of the grand tapestry. In the Dragonlance world of Krynn, there technically are no Drow. Krynnish elves use the term Dark Elf to mean an elf who has been exiled for heinous crimes or evil behavior. For example, the wizard Raceland's apprentice Dalamar is called a Dark Elf because he was cast out by his people for practicing forbidden magic. But he's physically just a Sylvanesti elf with maybe a slightly darker complexion. They don't have an Underdark civilization of dark-skinned elves, so if you bring a Drow into Dragonlance, it's as an off-world visitor or via a crossover. For all intents, Krynn doesn't contribute to Drow lore, except an example of how a setting intentionally said no Drow here, we do that trope differently. Dark Sun's post-apocalyptic world Athos once had elves, but by the present of the setting, those elves are nomadic desert runners, no Drow at all. In fact, an Arcane magazine article once posed that maybe Drow existed in Athos's distant past, but it was more a what-if than actual canon. Dark Sun was trying to avoid standard high fantasy tropes, so no Drow there. In the Spelljammer setting, D&D in space, which connects to all the AD&D worlds, Drow absolutely show up. In space, there are Drow pirates who helm spider-shaped spelljamming ships and raid commerce lanes. There's even a noted mercenary company of Drow called the 10th Pit, operating in Spelljammer. It's basically an extension of the same menace into wild space. So a campaign that took the party to different planets could certainly involve a ship of Drow Reavers attacking them among the stars. A fun twist on both pirate tropes and Drow tropes. Many DMS have also created their own settings or borrowed Drow elements. For instance, Matthew Mercer's Exandria, Critical Role's setting, later official in Wildemount book, we already mentioned. It has the Krynn dynasty, where Dark Elves, they don't usually call them Drow there, worship the Luxon. In Magic, the Gatherings crossover, Theros setting book, the concept of Drow isn't really present because Theros has its own take on elves. But the multiverse nature of D&D means you can drop Drow in anywhere if you like. Each setting that does include Drow tends to tweak them to fit the world's theme. But across all these, a few constants often remain. They are outsiders, living apart from surface societies, often underground or in dark places. They have a reputation, earned or not, for cruelty and cunning, and they are tied to powerful supernatural forces, be it Lolth, Volkor, or just ambient dark magic. The Drow are a case study in how a strong fantasy concept can be adapted in many ways. Gothic fae, tribal hunter, cosmic villain, anti-hero in exile, and still remain recognizably Drow. That adaptability has helped them remain relevant as D&D expanded into new worlds and genres. No exploration of Drow lore would be complete without looking at some major characters who have defined what it means to be Drow in D&D. Over the years, certain dark elves, whether heroes, villains, or deities, have risen to prominence in novels and game products. Let's highlight a few of the most famous and discuss how they've evolved across editions. If there's one Drow that even people who've never played D&D might know, it's Drizzt. Drizzt Do'Urden, the creation of author R.A. Salvatore, is arguably the most famous Dungeons and Dragons character of all time, certainly one of the most famous in the Forgotten Realms. First appearing in The Crystal Shard, 1988, as a supporting character, Drizzt quickly took center stage in subsequent novels. His backstory, told in Homeland, Exile, and Sojourn, the Dark Elf trilogy, captivated readers. Drizzt was born into House Do'Urden of Menzoberranzan, expected to be as cruel and ruthless as any other Drow. But from the start he was different, honorable, compassionate, and possessed of a conscience that rebelled against the evil of Lolth's society. He couldn't stand the perpetual viciousness of Drow life. The way his family murdered his siblings for advancement, the way slaves were treated, the wanton cruelty towards the weak. Trained as a warrior and with his mystical panther companion Gwenwyver by his side, Drizzt eventually fled the Underdark and made his way to the surface world. There he faced prejudice and misunderstanding. As one might expect, everyone thought Drow a monster. But he also found true friends and became a hero many times over, defending the North from evil. Drizzt's inner struggle, holding on to his principles in a world that expected the worst of him, is what made him special. As Salvatore often points out, Drizzt's story resonates because he does what's right even when it hurts. And indeed, Drizzt's journey is far from easy. He deals with loneliness, loss, and the temptation of anger. But over dozens of novels, we see him grow from the haunted exile to a confident ranger who fights for his new home and family, the Companions of the Hall. We also see the issues of being a good Drow addressed. Drizzt is constantly aware that people fear him at first sight, and he works to prove by his actions that he's not like those other Drow. Through Drizzt's eyes, readers got an unprecedented tour of Drow culture and the Underdark, as well as a meditation on nature versus nurture. He's the embodiment of the idea that alignment is not fixed by race, a notion that was far less common in the 1980s but has become almost standard now. Drizzt, in many ways, was ahead of the curve, blazing a trail that showed D&D fans a new perspective on a race that was previously just the bad guys. Across game editions, Drizzt's portrayal in game terms has changed mainly to keep up with rules. For example, in 2nd edition, he was given stats in the Hall of Heroes sourcebook, and was notably overpowered by normal PC standards. Hey, he's a legendary hero after all. In 3rd edition, he appeared in Forgotten Realms campaign setting and later Silver Marches, complete with dual-wielding feats and his pet panther as a figurine of wondrous power. By 5th edition, you see Drizzt in Out of the Abyss and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes art, and even got a brief stat block in an adventure. Each time, the point is to give DMs a benchmark for, this is what a very high-level Drow Ranger might look like. But more interesting is how Drizzt's story keeps evolving. In the 2010s books, he actually got married to Catti Bree, one of his longtime human friends, who was reincarnated as a reborn goddess chosen. He's faced new challenges, like outliving almost all his human friends, and even encountered Lolth's schemes directly in recent novels. And as mentioned, his latest trilogy introduced the idea that maybe Drizzt isn't such an outlier anymore, that there are other Drow out there who are not evil, something that astonishes Drizzt himself in the story. This mirrors D&D's evolution on Drow in general, almost as if the character of Drizzt is being used to shepherd that change in lore. Drizzt's impact on the game and fandom is immense. He inspired a whole generation of players to roll up Drow characters, to the point of the Drizzt clone meme. Every group had the brooding Drow Ranger PC in the 90s. He's been referenced in countless video games. The Baldur's Gate series, Neverwinter Nights, etc., often have an homage or cameo. And even within the lore, he's impacted other characters. For example, in one storyline, a Drow city hunts Drizzt to sacrifice him to Lolth, seeing his existence as an insult to their faith. Drizzt's evolution from renegade to legend parallels the game's evolving stance on the Drow from pure villains to complex people. Love him or hate him, Drizzt is inseparable from the conversation about Drow, and after 30-plus years of stories, he's still going strong, a testament to how compelling the idea of the hero from the most unlikely origin really is. While Drizzt might be the most famous character, Lolth is unquestionably the most influential entity when it comes to the Drow. From the very beginning, Lolth, also spelled Loth in early Greyhawk texts, has been the dark heart of Drow culture. She debuted alongside the Drow in 1st edition, first mentioned in 1978 as a mysterious demoness, then fully appearing as the final boss of Queen of the Demon Web Pits. Back then, Lolth was portrayed as a demon queen, one of many powerful demons, albeit one who had a special relationship with the Drow. She had both a spider form and a Drow form, and her stats in 1st edition were absurdly deadly, as they should be. She's a demon lord. Gary Gygax treated her as a demon first and a goddess second. Indeed, in those days, the line was blurry because AD&D had the concept of demon lords that could grant spells and effectively were gods to their followers. As the Drow got more development, Lolth evolved from a mere monster into a full-fledged deity with a fleshed-out personality and dogma. In the 2nd edition, especially in the realms, Lolth is explicitly a goddess, a lesser power in AD&D terms, of chaos, evil, and of spiders and Drow. She's the absolute supreme religion for virtually all Drow cities. Lolth's creed is one of constant chaos, fear, and the survival of the strongest. She encourages her followers to compete viciously, a chaotic sort of Darwinism that ensures only the most devious thrive. This doctrine conveniently keeps the Drow from uniting and challenging her, or conquering the surface en masse. She keeps them busy with infighting, and it feeds her with souls of the fallen and the blood of sacrifices. Lolth's depiction through 2nd edition and 3rd edition material is terrifying. She is at once a cunning schemer and a capricious, wrathful deity. One moment she might reward a priestess with great power. The next she might send a Yaklal, her handmaiden demons, to test that priestess's loyalty in some cruel way. The Driders, drow transformed into grotesque half-spider abominations, are a prime example of Lolth's cruel sense of meritocracy. Failing one of her tests can doom a drow to become a Drider, exiled and hated by their own kind. Succeeding might grant a boon, but also paints a target on one's back for rivals. Lolth basically keeps the drow in a perpetual state of violent zealotry. Across editions, Lolth's status shifted upward. In 3rd edition's Forgotten Realms, she was a greater goddess by the end of it. After the silence of Lolth, she ascended even higher in power. In 4th edition, as mentioned, they put her on par with other gods in the Astral Sea, and even had her split off the demon web pits into her own plane where she ruled uncontested. They also made her part of the core pantheon myth, former elf goddess turned demon queen. In 5th edition, she's firmly a deity. Her stats haven't been published. She's one of those beyond the scope of normal play gods now. However, 5th edition did something interesting in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. It gave us insight into Lolth's psyche. It talks about how Lolth, as Araushne, was once an elf of the Seldarine, but her ambition and pride led to her fall. It even humanizes or elfizes her a bit by explaining the philosophical difference between her and Corellon. Lolth valued destiny and order through strength in her early days, which twisted into outright cruelty, whereas Corellon valued freedom and art. This paints Lolth as more than a 2D villain. She genuinely believes in the might makes right ethos, and that the drow should rule because they are the strongest, at least the ones true to her ways are. Of course, she's also egotistical. She wants to be worshipped absolutely. Lolth's relationships with other characters have also evolved. In Greyhawk, she was somewhat standalone, though she had rivalries with Grazist, or the elder elemental god bit. In Forgotten Realms, she has a whole dysfunctional family. She is mother to Ilistrae and Veraon. In the realms, they made Ilistrae and Veraon actual offspring of Lolth, Araushne, and Corellon, which is a cool mythic touch. And she was also mentor to Selvetarm, a demigod she later basically got killed, and enemy to Ganadar, an ooze god some drow cults worship. The War of the Spider Queen storyline in 3rd edition Forgotten Realms was basically the tale of Lolth going into a cocoon to evolve, a very spider thing to do, and emerging stronger while her drow followers went into civil war without her guidance. It shows how central Lolth is. When she even briefly withdraws her favor, drow society collapses into even greater chaos. When she returned, she reordered the drow pantheon. She killed or diminished some of her rivals. Veyron was killed in novels. Ilistrae was thought slain too for a while. Consolidating power. In 5th edition realms, those two are back. Long story short, they got better. But Lolth remains queen of the demon web and primary goddess of most drow. As for depictions, Lolth is often depicted either as a beautiful drow woman, often with some spider features like black eyes, or as a terrifying Drider-like form, half female torso, half giant spider. Artists have had a field day with her imagery. She's usually surrounded by spiders or webs, sitting on a spider throne, etc. One memorable image from 4th edition is Lolth as a colossal spider with a crown, striding through her web realm. They even included her as a miniature, the size of a dinner plate. But interestingly, the Drow don't have many statues of Lolth. Instead, they use the symbol of a spider. Lolth's symbol, a black widow or a spider with a female Drow face, and her teachings, revered in the Spider Queen's Way, etc., have been consistent. In the game's narrative, Lolth fills the role of the ultimate evil mastermind that is both a deity and a direct antagonist. Players might not fight Lolth herself. That's usually beyond a typical campaign scope. But they often feel her influence, e.g. in Out of the Abyss it's revealed, spoiler, that Lolth had a hand in luring demon lords into the Underdark. A mad scheme to possibly eliminate competition or to radically reshuffle things to her advantage. Only a mind as insane and brilliant as Lolth would risk destroying the world just to see if she could come out on top. That's Lolth for you. In terms of evolution, Lolth started as a minor side villain, one among many in the Abyss, but grew into one of D&D's most fleshed-out and iconic deities. While her core, the cruel spider goddess of the Drow, has never changed, the surrounding context has. Where once she was pretty much just an antagonist to kill in a module, she's now a character with a millennia-long history, relations, and even published motivations, and as Drow evolve, one wonders how Lolth will react. If more Drow slip from her web, like some did in recent lore, will she adapt or attempt something drastic? If you ever run a storyline where the players aim to free the Drow from Lolth, you're tangling with one of the greatest evils D&D has to offer, and many have tried in lore. None have truly succeeded yet. Lolth is always one step ahead, it seems, spinning fate in her webs. Beyond Drizzt and Lolth, the Drow have a roster of intriguing characters who have appeared in adventures, novels, and sourcebooks. Here are a few worth noting and how they've left their mark on D&D history. We've mentioned Eclavdra a few times. Eclavdra is the original Drow High Priestess from Gygax's adventures. She was the one plotting with giants in G3, and in Vault of the Drow she's a major NPC. Eclavdra has an interesting arc across sources. In Greyhawk, she served Lolth, then betrayed Lolth to serve the Elder Elemental God, then returned to Lolth's favor later. She appears in Gary Gygax's Gord the Rogue novels as a powerful antagonist and consort to demons. Later, TSR and WotC kept her alive in canon. She's referenced in second editions from the Ashes Greyhawk material, and then much later in 5th edition. As noted, she's Lolth's chosen proxy in the Abyss. Eclavdra is the epitome of the ambitious, cunning Drow priestess. In many ways, she was the template for characters like Forgotten Realms' Quenthel Ban Ray, a similar high priestess figure in Menzoberranzan. If you want a classic Drow villainess for a campaign, Eclavdra's name carries old-school weight. She's also notable as one of the rare Drow who had influence outside the Drow. Her alliance with giants showed she had diplomatic, or manipulative, reach. Lyriel Benry is Drow protagonist from Elaine Cunningham's novels, Starlight and Shadows trilogy in the 90s. Lyriel was the daughter of Gromph Benry, Menzoberranzan's archmage, and through her stories, we saw a young Drow sorceress who loved adventure and eventually left the Underdark. She was notable for finding a way to bring Drow innate magic with her to the surface, overcoming a limitation that normally Drow lose some powers outside the Underdark. Lyriel's story touched on Alistray's faith as well. She's an example that Drizzt wasn't the only good Drow protagonist in town. her perspective as a mischievous, curious, and ultimately kind-hearted drow enrich the lore, showing, for instance, that some drow are just stifled by their society's strict rules and might blossom if given freedom. The flamboyant mercenary leader from Salvatore's novels, Jarlaxle Benray, has a huge fan following. He first appeared in Exile, 1990, and quickly became an iconic anti-hero. Jarlaxle is a male drow who has survived in the female-dominated society by being wily, useful, and charming. He leads Brigandairthe, a band of mercenaries comprised mostly of cast-off male drow, masterless rogues, houseless warriors, etc. Jarlaxle dresses ostentatiously, feathered hat, eye patch, which conceals a magic item, etc. Wields all sorts of tricksy magic items, and always seems to have an escape plan. What makes him fun is that he sometimes aids Drizzt or other heroes, but only when it serves his interest. He's the ultimate pragmatist, not exactly loyal to Lolth or anyone but his own sense of profit and adventure. Over the editions, Jarlaxle has shown up in various media, cameo in BGII video game, a central character in some 5th edition era novels, even a potential villain in the 5th edition Waterdeep Dragon Heist adventure. He's a testament that a drow doesn't have to be either noble hero or cackling villain. He's something in between, a survivor and opportunist who can be ally or enemy. In lore, Jarlaxle has gone from strictly Underdark operations to surface world intrigue. By 5th edition, he's been known to operate in Luskan and other surface cities as a master spy. He even, spoilers, plays the role of a dashing pirate in one story arc. Truly, he's expanded beyond being just a drow figure. He's almost like a dark elven James Bond meets Jack Sparrow. Drizzt's father and mentor from Salvatore's novels, Drizzt Do'Urden, was Menzoberranzan's greatest weapons master, forced to train the city's warriors while despising the cruel society. He secretly shared a moral compass similar to Drizzt's, and, in the end, in Homeland, sacrificed himself so Drizzt could escape to the surface. Zaknafein's character gave a face to the idea that not every drow in the cities is wholeheartedly evil. Some are trapped, finding small ways to resist. His legacy deeply affects Drizzt and is brought up in later plots, even revived in a later book, which led to father-son complicated dynamics. Matron Mother Ivanel Banre is essentially the big bad of Menzoberranzan for a huge chunk of the Drizzt saga. Matron Banre, part of whose name R.A. Salvatore gave to Jarlaxle as a surname, since Jarlaxle is actually her son, was the ruler of the first house of Menzoberranzan for over 1,000 years. She was ancient, powerful, and almost casually cruel, a direct avatar of Lolth's will at times. In 2nd edition and 3rd edition lore, she finally met her end in the Siege of Mithril Hall storyline. But her legacy continued. One of her daughters tried to carry on, and more recently in 5th edition era novels, a strange magical reincarnation, cloning, brought a young version of Ivanel Banner into the modern timeline. So the character, in a new form, lives on, navigating a changed world. Ivanel represents the classic Lolth priestess at peak power. Through her, we saw how a cunning matron could even humble demons or fend off gods' avatars when defending her city. She's kind of like the Queen of all Drow archetype, at least for one city, showing what ultimate success in Lolth's society looks like. It's terrifying. Viconia de Veer is a name known to many through the Baldur's Gate video games. Viconia is a drow cleric who can join your party. She was originally from Menzoberranzan, House de Veer. which, fun fact, was obliterated by House Do'Urden in the opening of Homeland novel. Salvatore collaborated with the game writers to tie that in. Viconia is interesting because she's somewhere in between evil and neutral depending on player choices. She's not a heroic type like Drizzt, but can develop into a loyal friend, or even romance to the player. Her popularity in the games definitely contributed to the Drow fascination of players. And in 5th edition's Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus module, they actually give a shout-out to Viconia, listing her as one of the city's notable NPCs decades after the games. So she's quasi-canon in the lore. As a character, Viconia showed how a drow might operate away from her people, her struggles with trust, and whether she'd cling to the Spider Queen or not. Quenthel Banray and the War of the Spider Queen crew in the 3rd edition era. Wizards authorized a big novel series written by various authors, set during Lolth's silence. The main drow characters in that were Quenthel, a high priestess daughter of Evenel, Farone, a witty mage, Danafe, a battle captive turning the tables, Rild, a warrior, and others. Without diving deep, these characters collectively showed a rare thing. Drow adventurers, albeit mostly evil ones, on a quest. Their personalities and betrayals made for an epic tale. Quenthel survived into later lore, continuing as Menzoberranzan's high priestess. In 5th edition, she's still around. The others met various ends. This series was an attempt to let readers get in the heads of multiple drow archetypes at once, and it reinforced some tropes. They backstab each other a lot, while subverting others. One of them actually sacrifices himself for a friend, showing the possibility of loyalty. It enriched drow lore with new locations, like the fallen city of Ched Nasad, and gave Lolth a big moment of transformation. Though not a mortal character, Eilistray is a very important Drow deity Sakjau figure. She is the good goddess of the Drow, daughter of Lolth, representing redemption, song, moonlight, and love. Eilistray first entered canon in 1991, and since then she's been the beacon of hope that Drow can find a better way. She appears in many stories as an encouraging, if bittersweet, presence. For example, she plays a role in Elaine Cunningham's novels, guiding Lyriel. And in the War of the Spider Queen epilogue, she actually returned to life by taking on the soul of a sacrifice, long story, to make sure her people still have hope. In 5th edition's Tome of Foes, Eilistray is mentioned as actively working to bring hope and joy to the Drow, and to guide them out of Lolth's darkness. While not on screen a lot, her impact on Drow characters who seek the light is huge. She gives DMs a divine figure to use if a Drow PC or NPC wants to turn away from evil. A literal patron of redemption. And her own evolution has been a roller coaster. Dying in 4th edition's transition novels, and then coming back in 5th edition lore, much to fans' relief. She, alongside the like-minded deity Eilistray, in Greyhawk lore they had an Eilistray-like goddess named Elana, but not quite the same, has solidified the concept that the Drow are not entirely forsaken. In-game, if a Drow character dances under the full moon and feels a tear of joy, that's Eilistray touching their heart. It's a beautifully poetic foil to Lolth's tyranny. There are many other named Drow in various sources, for instance, Shakti Hunsryn from AD&D's Menzoberranzan box, Fair from Baldur's Gate 2, Solaufine from the same, etc. But the ones above are some of the heavy hitters who have had a lasting presence. Each illustrates a facet of Drow lore, the unwavering villainous Eclavdra, the redeemed or redeemable, Lyriel, Zacnafine, Viconia, the trickster, Yarlaxle, the zealot, Quenthel, the hopeful deity, Ilastrae. Through them, we've seen the Drow not just as a faceless enemy race, but as characters, with desires, conflicts, triumphs, and tragedies. And as D&D's storytelling continues, new Drow characters will no doubt emerge, but they all stand on the shoulders of these legends of the Underdark. Having traveled from the earliest days of D&D to the present, what lies ahead for the Drow? Dungeons and Dragons is a living game, and its lore isn't static. In recent years, Wizards of the Coast has shown a clear intent to update and refine lore around fantasy races, including the Drow, to keep pace with modern sensibilities and storytelling trends. So let's speculate and examine how the Drow might continue to develop in the future of D&D. One major direction is inclusivity and moral complexity. As we've discussed, the trend from 4th edition through 5th edition has been to move away from always chaotic evil portrayals of intelligent species. The Drow are a prime example, once depicted uniformly as evil, barring the rare Drizzt. Now we have multiple official cultures of Drow in canon that are not evil. Wizards of the Coast has made statements in 2020 and beyond, acknowledging that having an entire race be born evil is an outdated trope. So going forward, expect new Drow lore to continue in this vein. Future sourcebooks might detail, say, a Drow city that broke away from Lolth generations ago and has a neutral or even good society, something unthinkable in old canon, but totally possible now. We may see more Drow player options that reflect these different upbringings. For instance, a sourcebook could allow a Drow character to choose Lolth-touched lineage or free Drow lineage with different perks. Wizards has already started doing this in a subtle way. The Spelljammer 5th edition set, 2022, introduced a playable astral elf that has a Descent into the Void trait, clearly paralleling the Drow's descent only in a space context, and Dragonlance, Shadow of the Dragon Queen, 2022, quietly omitted the term Dark Elf for Dalamar in favor of calling him a shunned Sylvanesti elf. These show a careful approach to how dark, evil-associated elves are presented. In the upcoming new iteration of the rules, 1D&D or the 2024 edition, race and lineage are being divorced further from alignment. So Drow characters will likely be presented as just another choice with maybe a sidebar about cultures. Even stat blocks for Drow NPCs might avoid words like typically evil. Already monsters of the multiverse remove many such tags. We've seen in the latest Drizzt novels that WotC is pushing the idea that Drow are diverse, not just in morality but even in appearance. The Avendro, for example, live in a bright white glacier, so they wear thick clothing and have slightly different features, though still recognizable as Drow. This is likely to be reflected in game lore too. Imagine a future Forgotten Realms campaign book that lists 3 Drow subcultures: Uda Drow, Underdark Drow, Lolthbound, the classic kind, Lorendro, Southern Forest Drow, perhaps more peaceful, and Avendro, Northern Ice Drow, isolationist but not evil. These terms are actually from Salvatore's books and a WotC article, so they could well make it into a sourcebook or UA, Unearthed Arcana playtest, in the future. By codifying these, DMs would have ready-made alternatives to the default Drow society. That means more plot hooks. Maybe in a future adventure, surface folk encounter the Avendro, and must adjust their preconceived notions about Drow. Or perhaps an alliance of non-Lolthite Drow bands together to stop a particularly nasty, Lolth-inspired plan. Another factor is media and storytelling outside the books. D&D is growing beyond just tabletop. We have video games like Baldur's Gate 3, 2023, where Drow are fully playable and integrated, and we have a D&D movie and TV series in development. If a D&D TV series or movie ever touches on Drow, it will likely follow the modern angle. It might feature an outcast Drow hero like Drizzt, or portray Drow society, but with nuance rather than one-note villainy. The popularity of characters like Drizzt and Jarlaxle means they could appear in such media, which in turn would influence official materials. Success of a Drizzt movie could mean a renewed push of Drizzt-focused sourcebooks or reprints. Wizards of the Coast is also keenly aware of the balance between preserving beloved lore and updating problematic elements. The Drow's dark skin equals evil issue has been a topic of debate. In-world, it's always been portrayed as a result of a curse or just the way that subrace is. But out of world, some have raised concerns. One way WotC addressed that was by making sure to show good Drow also with dark skin. So it's clearly not trying to equate darkness with morality. It's just their look. The introduction of other dark-skinned elf groups like the Lorendro, who are not evil, further breaks any perceived one-to-one association. I suspect future art and depictions will continue to ensure Drow are presented respectfully, likely fewer pin-up bikini-armored females and more realistic dark elf designs suitable for a complex culture. Already in 5th edition, the art took a step away from the chainmail bikini of earlier decades. On the game mechanics, design side, the future Drow might get some tweaks to make them more distinct or balanced. Sunlight sensitivity has always been a double-edged sword for Drow PCs. Some groups ignore it to not hinder the Drow player. Others keep it for verisimilitude. WotC might offer an optional rule where Drow from certain lineages lack sunlight sensitivity. Say an Evendro character who's used to bright snowfields might not have it, trading that for something else. They already removed the stat penalties that older editions gave to Drow. In ADD, Drow had level limits. In 3rd edition, level adjustment. In 5th edition, disadvantage in Sun. All ways to say, we want to discourage you from overusing this powerful race. Now that philosophy is more about balance and letting people play what they want, they might, for example, tone down a Drow's innate spells but remove sunlight disadvantage, making them equal to other races. The recent monsters of the multiverse did adjust Drow a bit, e.g., their darkness spell can be cast with a spell slot now instead of once per long rest, showing a trend to align them with new design standards. Narratively, I anticipate new story arcs that involve the Drow in upcoming D&D campaigns. Perhaps a hardcover adventure will delve into Menzoberranzan again. It's been a long time, since 2nd edition, that we had a deep dive product on that city. Given the interest, WotC might release a Menzoberranzan Revisited, or an adventure set in the Underdark, where players must navigate Drow politics. Think dragon heist intrigue, but in a Drow city. Only now with the new lore, players could attempt to sway factions to a more moderate path or even ignite a Drow civil war between Lolth loyalists and reformists. There's juicy material there for storytelling. Also, the return of other Drow gods like Eberron and Elastre in current lore means we could see adventures or sourcebooks about them. Maybe a module where adventurers actually help Elastre's followers establish a safe haven. On the flip side, Lolth isn't going anywhere as a villain. If anything, a more open-minded view of Drow makes Lolth even more villainous. She's the one keeping an entire people in fear and darkness. So future content might elevate Lolth as one of the big multiversal threats. Perhaps in a few years we'll get another Rage of Demons type event, where Lolth tries something catastrophic, like her attempt to bring demon lords into the Underdark. She could try to ascend to an even higher level of godhood, or unleash a scourge of driders on the world. Who knows? The heroes having to unite Drow and surface dwellers to thwart Lolth could be an epic campaign premise, kind of bringing the Drow story full circle, from being pure enemies to necessary allies. Wizards has also shown interest in crossovers, Magic, the Gathering settings, etc. If they ever do a major crossover with Drow, maybe we see Drow in Magic's multiverse. Already, there's a Magic card from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set for Lolth and one for Drizzt, signaling that these characters are recognized outside D&D's core. If any new fiction or novels come, besides Salvatore's, which likely will, they may tackle different Drow angles, maybe a novel about Elastre during the Spell Plague, or a story of Drow on the surface world carving out a niche, something akin to War of the Spider Queen, but where the heroes are not all evil. Finally, the community of fans and DMs continuously create content. See the Dungeon Masters Guild. We've already seen fan expansions like Menzoberranzan, City of Intrigue in 4th edition, and unofficial content addressing Drow representation. WotC pays attention to fan reception. The fact they brought back beloved elements like Elastre after fan outcry shows that the future of Drow lore will respect what the audience values about this race. So I suspect we won't see any radical 180 turn like Drow were aliens all along, or something that breaks their core identity. Instead, we'll see additive changes. More layers, more options, more ways to include Drow in any campaign responsibly and enjoyably. The Drow will continue to be those cool, dangerous yet intriguing figures that can either send a chill down players' spines when they appear as foes, or elicit a cheer when a Drow ally shows up dramatically to save the day. In summary, the future of the Drow in D&D looks bright or appropriately dim-lit. They will likely be portrayed in an ever more multidimensional way, not diminishing the classic imagery of the deadly dark elf, but expanding what that can mean. And as D&D grows, the Drow, one of its most iconic creations, will grow with it, spinning new tales in the weave of the game's rich tapestry. From ancient myths of dark elves to their first skirmishes in Gygax's modules, from the wicked halls of Errol-He-Chinlu to the tumultuous politics of Menzoberranzan, and from the classic days of all Drow are evil to the modern understanding of a varied and complex people, we've journeyed through the complete history and evolution of the Drow in Dungeons and Dragons. It's truly remarkable how this race has transformed over the decades. The Drow started as elusive villains lurking in the shadows of the early game, and have become a rich culture with heroes, anti-heroes, and deeply fleshed out villains of their own. They've been a mirror for D&D's own growth, reflecting changes in game design, storytelling, and values. We've seen how one idea, an elf turned dark by fate and faith, can spawn endless stories, whether it's the tragedy and redemption of Drizzt Do'Urden or the ceaseless ambition of Lolth, the Spider Queen. Through it all, the Drow remain one of D&D's most enduring and iconic creations. They challenge players in combat, yes, but they also challenge us to think about nature versus nurture, about prejudice and empathy, and about the allure of the forbidden. Whether you first met the Drow in the pages of a novel, the depths of a dungeon, or the screen of a video game, there's something undeniably captivating about them. Maybe it's the image of the midnight-skinned warrior dual-wielding blades, or the mysterious Drow sorceress weaving spells in the dark. Maybe it's the intricacy of their society, a cautionary tale of what unchecked evil and chaos can become. Or maybe it's the hope that even in such darkness there are stars, the belief that anyone from any origin can choose a different path. As D&D moves forward, we can look forward to new adventures and depictions of the Drow that continue to surprise and excite us. Will Lolth finally be overthrown? Will a Drow nation openly walk in the sun? Only the roll of time and dice will tell. What we do know is that the Drow will keep playing a major role in the multiverse of D&D, enticing new generations of fans to venture into the Underdark, or perhaps to create a Drow hero of their own. Thank you for joining this deep dive into D&D lore. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Drow and their impact on the game, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the multiverse of tabletop adventures. And if you have a favorite Drow memory from your own games, maybe a nail-biting encounter with a Drow war party, or a campaign where you played a Drow finding his destiny, share it in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive, one adventure at a time. Until next time, may Lolth spare you her attention, and may the moonlight of Illustrae guide your way out of the darkness. Happy adventuring.